The Kentucky Chamber has been consistently outspoken on the state's pension problems since 2006, and clearly it's the biggest challenge facing our state. We've tried to be a constructive voice in trying to solve those problems, and as we've represented over 60,000 employers in the state. The legislature has made some positive moves in recent years, but more attention and more diligence is needed as we move forward. Most of my comments will be about the KTRS work group. But first, with Auditor-elect Mike Harmon here, I'd like to thank him for his willingness to embrace the idea that we called for earlier this year for a comprehensive performance audit for KRS. We will be working with him to see that audit move ahead ASAP, rather than waiting for the 2016 budgeting process and possible funds coming forward in 2017. If indeed the auditor's office doesn't have the money to bring in outside expertise, I think we've got to turn to LRC to use some of their existing dollars to get that process started as soon as Mr. Harmon is sworn in. Frankly, we can't afford to lose a year to get on with that task. And virtually, I think, including the KRS Board of Overseers or Trustees has now said, yes, we need to do that audit. Also, we have concerns about the use of placement agents. We've encouraged the legislature's Pension Oversight Board to call the two retirement systems before them at the same time and ask some basic questions about placement agents. Interestingly, we've got one system that swears by them, and we've got one system that has a policy against using them. And that leaves a lot of us in Kentucky scratching our head as to what is the rightful role and the proper payment to placement agents. But that's for another day. So for now, regarding KTRS and the governor's working group, I'm not the chairman, and I can't speak for the group, but I will give you my observations, and others here can chime in. We've been meeting since July, and the last meeting is scheduled for just 2 weeks from now on December 1st. That was part of the governor's call, was that we would produce findings by December. I think there are 23 members, including at least 6 legislators. Chairman David Karam, I think, has done an outstanding job of moderating a broad range of opinions. And our consultant, William Fornia, who has the delightful nickname of Flick, for a very serious guy, I think that's a pretty lighthearted nickname. But anyhow, so if you hear us talking about Flick, that's the consultant. And I'm impressed with him. He's been, I think, very responsive to the group, seems very objective. So the choice of the consultant has not become an issue, as far as I can tell, with the group. Senators Thayer and Senator McGarvey are on that working group. Representative Montel has been actively participating with the group, and Representative Graham, of course, is on that group. Although we're nearing the end of the process, we have not achieved a consensus yet. I don't think you can expect a grand proposal with all the loose ends tied up to come out of the group. I think instead you will see a fairly useful set of options. In effect, a shopping list of options with price tags, or our consultants' best guesses as to what projected cost or savings there might be, and then maybe pros and cons of each thrown in. At the last meeting, there was a draft set of principles put before the group that was not adopted. It was discussed to some degree, but I noticed in my email yesterday we all got a revised version of that, slightly tweaked, and we're being asked for input and all. A state of principles about things like the current situation is not acceptable. I mean, that was like draft principle number 1, and I think most of us would agree with that. The range of perspectives among the 23 members is pretty broad. I think you've got folks there who just say the legislature ought to pay the bill, and that probably involves new revenue, so you ought to raise taxes and let's get on with it. Then you have some there who've said, well, let's borrow $3.3 billion, use that money to leverage the market and get some relief from the fact that interest rates are low. That's basically the proposal that came from KTRS last time, passed through the House, and didn't get anywhere in the Senate. Then you have those there, too, who say, hey, let's convert future teachers to a 401k. What's the big deal? Let's get on with it and get the state out from under this liability in future years. And we heard a fair amount of that type of thinking in this last governor's race. So you've got a wide range of opinions on this group. During our last few meetings, I've asked the consultant and the group to explore a few scenarios. We haven't made a big chamber proposal, but we said, hey, let's look at this and this and this. One of those is what I would call a shared responsibility model. That approach worked very well for you and for KRS when you did the 2013 reforms of the state and local pension system, KRS. It also worked when KTRS took it upon himself to bring stakeholders together, hammer out a compromise. I think it was in 2010, and they brought you kind of on a silver platter. They said, here's our compromise to save our health care cost, the health insurance issues that were plaguing KTRS, and that quickly passed the legislature. That shared responsibility idea also worked in 2010 when a group of us from labor and business, we hammered on each other for about 8 months and finally came with a compromise on unemployment insurance. Remember during the recession, and the state of Kentucky owed almost $1 billion to the feds, and the legislature passed that, bipartisan. So shared responsibility seems to make sense when we've got really, really tough issues to solve. So we've asked the consultant, what would a 50-50 plan look like? What would it be? What would be involved in dollars and cents if 50% of the solution came from more revenue and 50% came from restructuring the system? In other words, looking at the benefits for future teachers. Now, we realize, and there's been a fairly broad consensus within the group, that the inviolable contract is an inviolable contract. That has not been seriously contested in these proceedings. For one thing, even people who would like to question some of that realize that there would be years of legal battles in court if you ever decide to really challenge that. And I've referred to that as kind of the nuclear option, that nobody wants to go there right now. There are 3 little things, though, that are outside the inviolable contract as it relates to current teachers and retirees. One has to do, I think, with how the sick leave is calculated in your final pay, and there are relatively small dollars, I think, involved with those 3 items that are considered outside the inviolable contract. So most of the real dollars that you might find in terms of structural changes, for example, if you demanded that teachers in the future have to work to age 58 or 60 or 62, the real dollars come from future teachers. So we've asked, what does a 50-50 look like? Just show us numbers as to what that would be. And then I've also asked the last 2 meetings for a cost estimate on what a conversion to a 401k would be. Now, the chamber does not have a solid proposal that we ought to go to a 401k, but frankly, if you ask businesses in this state, my guess is that 80% of them, if you stopped them on the street corner and said, what do you think ought to happen with this state pension problem, they'd say, move them to a 401k. We did that 20 years ago. What's the deal? So the challenge there, though, I think those of us on the KTRS working group realize is, A, teachers are not covered by Social Security. So if you converted and snapped your fingers and converted tomorrow, the state would have to start paying Social Security, the state and school boards, Social Security, plus you'd have to go back and somehow fix the underfunding of the current system. It's not like we have a 100% full funded system where you can make a clean conversion tomorrow morning. You have to go back and pick up those legacy costs. Plus you have current teachers who have been promised that they will have a retirement benefit, inviolable contract benefit, and you have current retirees who certainly expect that benefit to continue. So you've got the reality of a lot of people in the private community, and a lot of voting citizens out there say, yeah, convert. 401k is what my employer does. Why should others have something else? But you've got the cost implications of a conversion, and we've asked the consultant, take us there. Tell us, don't just tell us you prefer a defined benefit plan. Show us the numbers. So that's in process. At our last meeting, Senator Bowen, you recall the consultant threw us a bit of a curveball. He presented a new scenario. We've been told all along that it would take 14% additional money, in other words, on top of what the state is paying now for teachers.
Which, Dave, let me stop you and let me remind the committee, I think that figure is about $750 million annually. Am I correct on that, Brad? That includes health insurance, 735. So that's what the state's appropriating now. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what, so you take another, what, 420, I think, on top of that. In other words, to fix this system in 30 years, you need to pay 14% of all payroll for teachers more. So, all right, here comes the curveball, the consultant, and I mean, he's operating in good faith. He's not trying to deceive us or anything, but he came forward and he said, well, here's a possibility. You could phase into this deal over 12 years. And if you added 1% this next year, in other words, in the 2016 session, you added 1%, which is about 35 million for fiscal 17, another 1% for 18, so you'd be up to 70 million plus a little bit because of inflation, and a 1% and a 1% and 1% for 12 years. The 12-step program. First, you have to acknowledge that you've got a problem, right? In the 12-step program. Well, this is a 12 stair-step deal, and then for 18 years, you settle at that, I think, 420 and pay all the way to 30. So, I mean, in one sense, it was almost too good to be true. I mean, the fact that you could ease into this pain that way. We have a few questions, and we're all waiting. He said he would send us his spreadsheets, and, you know, Gary Harbin at KTRS and KEA, the Chamber, everybody, all of us will be looking at that to see, you know, can you poke holes in it, or is this real? So, a couple of concerns. It kind of throws the idea of shared responsibility out the window because that whole plan is the state will just pay more. Graduated, you know, 12 steps, but it'll pay more. And teachers will simply be asked to accept what's basically on the books now. A couple little exceptions in terms of a surcharge that's being charged that would have to be continued and that sort of thing. So the idea of shared responsibility, certainly the idea of a 50-50 goes out the window. And a concern that we have that it's kind of it might be a feel-good plan for a few years, but then you look at 5, 6, 7 years down the road and you're paying a few $100 million more, and all of a sudden you're in the territory of how much the economists have said the economy will produce in new money for your whole budget. I mean, you're getting up to real dollars here in a few years. So what do the out years look like? Second concern is what are the bond agencies, what are bond rating agencies going to say about that? They want firm plans. So if our plan is to staple a 12-year graduated deal to our legislation this next time and say we really, really promise to keep doing this, you know, will they accept that? A hard promise would be if let's say the bonding had gone through and you had to make the bond payments every year, that's a hard promise. This is saying, we sure plan to make 12 years worth of increased payments. So that's a little bit of a concern. Also, and this is a key point, I think that plan, we would have to question, does it really address the demographic changes and the structural problems with a plan that was created in 1938? Here's a key fact. If this were Sesame Street today, today's number is 16. That's how many more years the average adult lives today than they did when KTRS was created July 1 of 1940. 15.8. 15.8 more years. So you've got a system. Oh, and by the way, since somewhere along the way we reduced the minimum required, the minimum required years of service from 30 to 27. So in effect, you have a net 19 years that this system's being asked to fund from when it was created. So that obviously puts a strain on a retirement system, a defined benefit retirement system. So we think there are going to have to be some structural changes regardless of what graduated plan or phase-in that we look at. The calculation of sick leave as compensation in the last year of service produces a very expensive spiking to benefits and cost to the state. We think that would be relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of a structural reform. And then I think we've got to look at a minimum age, a retirement age. Most people in the world can't get Social Security until 62. So you have a discrepancy there in what's going on in our society and in the demographics. Let me say that several members of the working group have made the point, I think Representative Graham, you've made this, and it's a good point, that we have to be careful what we do because of what it'll say about the profession of teaching. And we're not unaware of that. We're not unappreciative of that. You can have some unintended consequences. And there's already concern, especially in the education community, about the attractiveness of teaching to young college students and others. So we have to be careful in what we do in terms of what we say to future teachers about their ability to support themselves in a solid career. But one thing to keep in mind is that this problem is so massive and so expensive that if we don't fix it, or excuse me, how we solve it will have significant ramifications on the future of teachers in terms of their ability to get salary increases. If you just went out and the legislature decided in 2016, we'll make the ARC, we'll grit our teeth and make the ARC payment, actuarial required contribution payment, there would be absolutely no money for salary increases for teachers. Matter of fact, you'd have to cut dramatically in education, higher education, state police, and everything else to make that tough a payment. Let me mention one other issue here, and that's bonding, which got a lot of play in the last session of the legislature. You know, KTRS can look at bonding, pros and cons. The working group that we've been talking about can look at bonding as an option to help rescue KTRS. And we can debate the pros and cons of that, but you as legislators have a significantly tougher job and a bigger responsibility, and that is you've got two retirement systems to watch out for. And the other one, if you look across town at KRS, they're using assets to pay benefits, and they're precariously close to getting down to, I think, 1.5 billion in assets where they would have to go virtually to all cash. Then they can't earn their way out of anything. So the bonding capacity of the state of Kentucky might be needed, and I hate to sound like doomsday here, but it might be needed over on that side more than it is to provide some relief of pain on the KTRS side. Now, if I'm picturing that wrong, I want somebody to correct me on that, but I think you all have the responsibility of two retirement systems, one of which is in greater trouble than the teachers. One point that came out loud and clear last Friday in our last meeting from the bond experts, they had a fellow from Morgan Stanley here, and he presented the working group, and he said, Kentucky's got to do something in the 2016 session. He didn't hesitate to say that he was absolutely confident that our bond rating would go down again if we just kicked the can in 2016. And I realize the political pressures. When you talk about who's going to take the House, who's going to keep the House, all that's real. But we can't use that as an excuse to say, let's wait until maybe the next year and maybe have a special session or something. I think we've got to do something in 2016.